Hello and welcome. Well, January is now well advanced and Candlemas is in sight, and still no end to what promises to be a very long and a very difficult period of lockdown for all of us, notwithstanding the arrival of the vaccines that are now being rolled out. And part of what we're called to do as Christian people in this pandemic is look for signs of God, to try to seek God, to pray individually and together, to study God's Word, and to reflect God's creativeness in creative ways of reaching out to others, and perhaps in our own creativity, our own search for beauty. So many seem to be turning to art, to craft, to song, to new ways of doing all that. Cookery, baking. There's quite a long list of ways that people are seeking to become co-creators with God. The search for beauty, the search for loveliness, if you like, is a long one. Going right back to 1971, a long time ago now, 50 years. There's a famous film at the time with Dirk Bogarde as a German composer called Aschenbach. The film is called Death in Venice. And it's particularly appropriate film because it's set in a time of pandemic in the city and the islands in the Venice Lagoon in the late Edwardian era. Aschenbach has a crisis. Unable to find a new route to composition, he seeks instead a perfect form of beauty. And in his case, it is very much his undoing. For him, beauty is represented by a beautiful young man, played famously in the film by Bjorn Andersen. Who's just, by the way, resurfaced in a horror film, of all things, after a career break of the best part of half a century. This search for beauty in this young man disappoints. It is not a fulfillment for Aschenbach. In the poem by Catherine Charney that we're looking at today, it's a very short poem, very lovely poem. God is depicted as a deer. This isn't the sort of Ashton Court type deer that we're all used to seeing, not the sort of deer that you'd go to Exmoor to hear bolving in the right time of the year. It's not that sort of out there deer that we're used to in our imagery and our pictures, like this one. It's rather a deer that is swift, elusive, almost say puzzling, hard to pin down. The sort of deer that you may only encounter through chance and exploration. It's a deer that's often hidden in the foliage of our lives. As we frantically, and sometimes not so frantically, seek for the Holy Grail of God's presence and God's consolation. And in this poem, we feel with the poet as she sees glimpses of this fleeting, sure-footed deer This deer that for her represents God's presence. It's just round the corner. It's running across the road in front of her. It's hidden in the trees. It's a faint step. Glimpses of beauty, glimpses of presence. And we feel with her in her frustration and her loss. And yet God's promises, we know, are true. God's promises, we know, are sure and steadfast. And the deer's presence is often used in the Bible to symbolize the work of God, the sure-footedness of God, and the way God seeks to restore us to our own sure-footedness, even now. Listen to this excerpt from the 22nd chapter of the second book of Samuel. It's part of David's celebration of God's presence in his life. 2 Samuel 22. For who is God but the Lord, and who is a rock except our God? This God is my strong refuge, and has made my way blameless. He made my feet like the feet of a deer, and set me secure on the heights. You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your gentleness made me great. So let's listen as we close to this short poem of that elusive but ever-present God who longs to tabernacle with us. And may God be present to us in our journeyings too, because ultimately, like a deer, God is graceful. It is all grace, and God longs to fill us with a sense of it. Lord, I glimpse you, like a young deer flitting between streams. A gleam of flank or antler, a hoof thud on turf. Too swift for me your leaps, too delicate your poise.